In the last videos, we discussed the different web's depth of knowledge levels and why they're useful for assessment. In this video, we're going to go through some examples of items at the different DOK levels. Remember this DOK wheel? It includes descriptions and verbs associated with each of web's depth of knowledge levels. One thing worth noting, though, is that the verbs in this wheel are just guides. More than just the verb is needed to determine the depth of knowledge of an item. The context in which the verb is used must also be considered, as well as the thought process used to answer the question. Take, for instance, the verb compare. It's in both DOK2 and DOK3. In this case, and in all others, you, the content expert, will need to determine the level of complexity based on the context of the item and not just on the verb. Take this item again, for example. It includes both estimate, a DOK2 word, and measure, a DOK1 word. If you think about what the question is really asking students to do, it's ultimately asking students to read a measurement tool and use a certain level of precision when doing so. In this case, the word estimate is really just referring to getting a precise reading rather than calculating something. Because this item asks students to complete the relatively simple task of reading a measurement to a certain level of precision, it's a DOK1 item. This is why it's important to remember that the DOK wheel is just a guide, and determining DOK is really about considering how complex an item is. Now let's look at an example of a DOK2 item. This item requires students to understand the difference between sensory neural and conductive hearing loss. This item also requires students to interpret the chart and evaluate the level of hearing loss in each ear. Because students have to complete multiple steps that involve distinguishing between types of hearing loss, interpreting a graph, and classifying the hearing loss they see, it makes it a DOK2 item. Next is an example of a DOK3 question, which is typically the highest depth of knowledge that can be assessed using multiple choice items. In this example, in order for students to answer this question correctly, they have to do 3 things 4 times. They have to think through a process that involves incrementing using global clicks plus 1, then evaluate a conditional, and then increment by a variable value that keeps changing. This last step in particular is often a novel situation for students. Students have to work through each of these 3 steps 4 times to answer this problem correctly. Because this item asks students to use multiple concepts to solve a non-routine problem, this item is a DOK3. And while we're talking about non-routine problems, one thing that we push for is when writing these items, try to take the concepts that students are learning in class and put that knowledge or skill into a new, novel situation. To really see if students learn the material, you have to pull them out of their comfort zone and see if they can apply it to a situation that's maybe not directly out of the curriculum or an activity that they've done before. Keep that in mind. This is how some of the best, most informative assessments are created. So, as you might be able to tell from this discussion, figuring out the correct DOK level requires understanding of the content. Simply looking at the words or images used isn't enough, but the DOK wheel is a good guide and a good place to start. And with that, we conclude our discussion about web's DOK levels. Before moving on to the next topic, be sure to check out any accompanying DOK activities that need to be completed.